Good evening. My name is Ken Macintosh. I'm the presiding officer at the Scottish Parliament. It's my delight to welcome you to this special online edition of the Edinburgh International Cultural Festival Summit. Beg your pardon. This is the first in a series of webinars looking at the transformational power of culture. And what we're going to do is we're going to respond to the film we've just seen about culture in vibrant communities. We're going to consider, for example, how we need a holistic approach to architecture. And we're invited to reflect on the post-pandemic power of galleries, museums, libraries, performing arts centres and so on, and their role in rebuilding trust and preserving our communities. Now, what are the places we miss? What are the policies, funds and infrastructure required to sustain those places? We're delighted that you are all able to join us this evening to participate in this webinar. And can I just suggest that you use the chat or the Q&A function on the site to, first of all, to introduce yourself and to say where you're joining from, and then to ask a question. But I'm particularly pleased, if I may, to begin by introducing our three panelists who are going to kick us off. From Mexico, Dr. Pablo Raphael de la Madrid, Director General, Cultural Promotion and Festivals at the Secretary of Culture. Now, Dr. Raphael has been Cultural Advisor of the Mexican embassies in Portugal and Spain, as well as Director and Founder of the Cultural Centre El Octavo Dia. He is not only a diplomat, but he's also a narrator and essayist, and has written for a number of newspapers and magazines. He has taught 20th century literature at university and lectured in various forums on the future of the Spanish language. He is also a member of the board of the International Federation of Arts Councils and Culture Agencies. So welcome, Dr. Raphael. From Boston in the United States, our second panelist will be Rahul Mehrotra, who we actually just saw Rahul contributing to our film. Rahul is Professor of Urban Design and Planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. He's a practicing architect, urban designer and educator. His Mumbai-based firm RMA Architects has managed projects including government and private institutions, corporate workplaces, private homes and unsolicited projects driven by the firm's commitment to advocacy in the city of Mumbai. Mr. Mehrotra has written, co-authored and edited a vast repertoire of books on urban history, historic buildings, public spaces, planning processes and architecture in India. And finally, I'm pleased to welcome a fellow Scot, Nicola Cullen, OBE, Chief Executive Officer of Sistema Scotland. And interesting fact, Nicola was the very first employee of Sistema Scotland back in 2007. Over the past 13 years, the organisation has grown from the original pilot programme to a charity of national significance. They now have a network of 4 big noise programmes delivered by more than 130 high-quality staff and 80 volunteers supporting more than 2,800 children. And this is some of Scotland's most disadvantaged communities. She was awarded an OBE for services to music, children and community cohesion in the 2020 New Year's Honours List. So now there will be an opportunity for all of us online to put questions and views to the panel throughout this event. And again, I would emphasise if you could please enter your name, where you're from, in the Q&A box, and also who you might be directing the question to. However, I'd like to begin, if I can, by asking each of our panelists to share their thoughts and reflections on the film we have all just seen with our audience. And I wonder, Dr. Raphael, may I start, sorry, Pablo, I think we're going to call you, I'm giving you your proper name, Pablo. Can I ask you to start us off?
Fantastic. We start with me. Thank you very much. In the name of Minister Alejandra Frauso, I would like to thank the summit organizers, the British Council, the Edinburgh Festival for the invitation, and say that it's a pleasure to be here with you, Ken, with Rahul and Nicola. I understand that it's very hard to talk in 5 minutes about thinking and action in vibrant cultures, but I will do my best. First, saying that I think these uncertain times has shown us the value and the risk of the world change, because we are not living just a change of cultural policies or a change in culture. We are living a change of the idea of culture. And on this, I am very optimistic in these pandemic days. The pandemic, the COVID-19 have shown us that history have got good points on that too. Just remember the 1606 pest took William Shakespeare, and that was the time to write Macbeth. Or the 16th century pest in Sevilla have a consequence that we call the Spanish Gold Century. Or just think in the Black Pest in Florence and at the end of 14th century that gave us just a thing called the Renaissance. Or the Viruela pest in Tenochtitlan that killed 8 million people, but also create the mestizo culture that built the current Mexico. In that path of our cultural globalization, for example, Mexican tomato and Chinese noodles invented the Italian food, or pre-Hispanic herbolaria actualized the European medicine, or the innovation of cows and horses helped to make progress in American farmers and agriculture. Or a very small mollusk called the grana cochinilla changed the history of colorants in Flemish paintings. So we are living a change in the art of creation. We are living a change in the idea of culture, and we are living a change in the cultural sector and in the cultural policies. But unlike in the 16th century, we now have the knowledge and the instrument to put culture in the center of development policies. This is the idea that we are working on the Ministry of Culture in Mexico. And we decide to step down from the opera box to the plaza, because we believe that culture is very effective to rebuild the social network, because we believe that culture is fantastic and a fantastic instrument for peace and making processes, because culture is a very strong tool for economic development. The change of paradigm in cultural policies, it means to understand that our work for those who work on cultural policies is not to bring culture to every corner of the country or the continent of the region. In fact, our job is about to recognize that in every corner we have cultural agents who need to find the way out in local, regional, national, and international circuits. That's why we are working in a program called a Community Cultural Program, or Programa de Cultura Comunitaria, to redistribute the cultural wealth using the social units called cultural seedbeds, semilleros culturales, to prepare artistic groups for kids and youngs, but also to make a takeover of the public spaces and attend those municipalities, about 700, affected by narco violence and poverty. That's why also we are working in recovering 7,000 public libraries in active places and knowledge keys for the communities. That's why we are implemented a program called Cultura Alimentaria, food culture, that looks forward to creative virtuous circuits of tourism and gastronomy, health and education, popular culture, and environmental education. That's why also we present just this week the Chapultepec Art and Nature Project as an environmental and cultural model that will be Mexico City a renewed long of 800 hectares in a net of bridges, natural spaces, museums, and cultural nodes. That's why we're working in a model we call Mexico Creativo, Creative Mexico, that impulses the economy, development of creative industries, and development of cultural ecosystems that help to build communities, and in these times, rebuild the cultural sector after COVID-19. That's why we are implementing Contigo en la Distancia, with you on the distance. That is not just a digital platform on content, also it has been a program to finance and give direct support for the artists and creators. The idea is to keep building community and find ways to close the gap existing between the digital and the physical economies. That's why also we are working with UNESCO in the organization of the Global Congress of Cultural Policies, Mundiacult 2022. And the idea is, like we are doing in this forum, is to have a dialogue and find ways to put the culture in the same level of importance than health, jobs, and education. The mission is making understand governments and entrepreneurs and social actors that culture is a transversal objective of the 2030 Agenda for Global Development. The Italian writer Clara Miller used to say, the future has an ancient heart, and I believe that culture is that heart. Thank you very much.
Pablo, thank you very much indeed. Can I just say that was a really welcome, optimistic look at the role of culture, particularly in the face of the bleak pandemic that is consuming our countries at the moment. We'll come back obviously for the discussion shortly, but if I may now turn to Rahul Mehrotra. Rahul, I think you're actually joining us from Boston, Massachusetts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Pablo, for those those ideas and the way you kind of framed your response. Is everything good? You can hear me and all that? Yes. Okay, thanks. So I just want to kind of pick up from where kind of Pablo left us off. And, you know, really the pandemic has made us look at many relationships differently, the home and the world for one, but also I think as human beings, we've also, I think, had to, and I think in a nice way, negotiated how we even relate to each other in physical terms, whether you call it social distancing. We become much more mindful about each other's presence actually in this virtual space, in the limited physical space. We've become much more careful and respectful of what transgressions might mean. And so we are actually implicitly morphing into cultural norms, which I believe will leave a trace. And this is exactly what culture is about. And this is what allows us an opportunity. And this is what I kind of got from the film and the many discussions that Jonathan has had us going through over the many months as part of this festival in this new mode. And so therefore, I think what I kind of get out of this discussion is this is an opportunity, and I'm speaking from the perspective of an architect, to imagine how the spatial dimensions of making culture, of promoting culture, facilitating culture, can also be rethought. And I think Pablo's sort of suggestions of the different kinds of things and programs are already beginning to suggest that. For example, Ismail Seragaldin in the film, when he talks about the great Alexandria Library and how now there's a need for curation, there's a need to even make space within the library for what were unforeseen as the kinds of uses that would have been even compatible with the silence and the kind of atmosphere of a library. This is all about extending in a kind of elastic way the margins of our spatial imagination in a way that we can facilitate and make space for culture in new imaginaries triggered off by this kind of condition of the pandemic. And so therefore, I think the question sort of that naturally extends from that is, why should infrastructure for culture all be static? They can, I think, I think we have to question whether buildings are the only mode by where we can contain and create the platforms for the construction of culture, for the making of culture, for these cultural rules, which are these implicit sort of relationships that we set up in society to actually evolve. And I think this becomes a critical moment to do that. Now, I'm not making a case that the whole world should be organized in this kind of temporal, ephemeral way, but that I think we need to give that dimension more space to more productively facilitate, cultural infrastructure or new imaginations of cultural infrastructure, for us. And I think from that, I think the important issue is the notion of accessibility. This came up in the film through many speakers, whether it's the garden in Cairo. It creates a new form of accessibility and mobility, new forms of equity. It's a way of sharing infrastructure, which implicitly then also begins to produce culture. So accessibility is broad. It's not just accessibility in terms of someone who's physically challenged getting access to the space, but it's also access of a much broader spectrum of society. And for that to happen, cultural infrastructure needs to be mobile. It needs to penetrate society. It needs to disrupt the kinds of relationships that people assume and take for granted, which is what, in a funny way, the pandemic has done. And so this cultural infrastructure, if it can be mobile, it can be ephemeral, reversible, it can begin to penetrate societies and communities, also in the way that Pablo said now, the activation of plazas instead of just looking at buildings is already one dimension of that kind of new imagination. And I think these are interesting possibilities. I want to just sort of end with, a kind of broader rubric, which is the idea of a kind of transition that this pandemic has put us in. I think the world wars put us in a transition. It was a transition of demographic shifts. It was a transition of economic model shifting, political power reconfiguring itself. And in a sense, the pandemic has also put us, with the combination of climate change and how you couple these two together, has put us in a really rather intense transitionary phase on this planet. And in a transitionary phase, to think about solutions for cultural infrastructure in absolute terms would be a complete mistake, because what we would, and even though I'm an architect, I say this, is we would create perhaps permanent solutions for temporary problems. Or put another way, architecture can sometimes be part of the problem, not the solution to the problem. And so we've got to be critical in the way we imagine cultural infrastructure in this phase of transition, in this phase of flux, that we put on hold many preconceptions and try things out. Experiment might be a simpler word to use, but this becomes an interesting moment to do that. And I think for me, these conversations have actually expanded, opened up, and actually reinforced that as being a reality that we should deal with. And I think finally, the evolution of culture, the making of culture, the robustness of culture, the resilience of culture, the sustainability of cultural norms depend on the ability of people to engage, and people to engage not only with each other, but with the cultural infrastructure that our governance systems puts forth for society. So this is a kind of case where I think it's not only a top-down or a bottom-up, but it's meeting really halfway. And it's truly an opportunity to reimagine cultural infrastructure for our cities, for our settlements, and for our societies more broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rahul. At one point there, I thought you were going to talk yourself out of a job as an architect, and so there's less role for architects in this new post-pandemic world. But we'll come back to that. I'm sure that's not quite where you're going. I wonder if I could introduce the third of our panelists this evening, Nicola Cullen. Nicola, can I ask for our fellow Scot for your thoughts on where we go now?
Thank you, Kenneth. And so interesting to listen to Pablo and Rahul. And I hope that this links really neatly into many of those concepts around about how we use our culture for maximum benefit for society, but also this idea about meeting in the middle and an elastic way of thinking of our roles. The film sort of highlighted for me both the importance of our social and cultural spaces and how we're using those spaces to gather and to organise and to connect ourselves. But what has really been preoccupying me in my mind over the past few months has been how, as organisations, individuals and institutions, we can use what we know now about the benefits of access to positive social connections and cultural participation to maximise our recovery for our communities from COVID. How can we ensure that we can retain and rebuild vibrant communities and cities whilst living with COVID-19? But how can we also ensure that we re-establish what good looks like? We're honest about where it wasn't working and we can make things stronger. As we all know, COVID-19 has affected us all differently. So those who were already living in poverty and with inequality will have been impacted more greatly. So I feel there's a calling now to ensure that our work is directed and targeted even more to enhance the lives of those who have suffered most, who are becoming more disadvantaged in our societies. So I believe if we can do this, we will create even more vibrant communities, cities and infrastructures in the future. And I wanted to use an example from our work at Sistema Scotland and at Big Noise. And Rahul, I think this links quite neatly into some of the things you were talking about questioning buildings and questioning that infrastructure. When we started 12 years ago in a tiny community in Scotland that was one of the most socioeconomically deprived, there was one child there that played an instrument, and we were there to try to create a children's orchestra. We started with no physical infrastructure. It was just us. So as we wanted eventually to have an office and to have rehearsal space, but we just started with no buildings, no infrastructure, nothing. So we just talked to the community. Where did the community actually go? What did they like? Could we come and introduce ourselves to them? And by following the existing social infrastructure and the existing cultural infrastructure within that community, as a group of musicians, we went to the football club, we went to the bingo, we went to the post office, we went to the playgrounds, and we played music and we talked to people where people gathered. We started to build connections with the people there, and we shared our stories about who we were, what brought us there, what we wanted to offer, and why did we think it was beneficial. That community where we worked in Scotland, and we still work there, lives just on the outskirts of a city. So it's literally 10 minutes by bus. However, the children and young people at that time, they didn't engage with the cultural assets and offerings that were there within their own city. However, as we started to create an orchestra with the community, the ownership of this was immense. We started with the children performing in their local community centres, and then we moved to perform in the local concert hall, and then we moved to the national venues, and now the children that started in that programme 12 years ago are represented in almost every national youth music making ensemble in Scotland. So what was important that we paid attention to? Connections between all of our infrastructures are important. We started with the very local and we build outwards from there. But connections between us as human beings was paramount. So we paid attention not just to what was scheduled and happening in the room, but to the spaces in between. The film talks about the important role of libraries and playgrounds as places where communities feel safe to connect. And that space, I believe, if used well by the humans who are given the responsibility for them, can create an environment for small risks to be taken every day. So by connecting as humans during our coffee break, in the queue and the line, as people waiting for a workshop to start, that's where I believe we start to build trust and connection that allows us to take risks together. What can we learn from our local community infrastructures that can actually influence how we redesign our national infrastructure and how we think about how our national buildings work? Those who are most disadvantaged can find it harder to trust others. And COVID-19 has necessitated that we can't have all of these gatherings, that we can't get into our school buildings and our communities as much as we normally would have. So we've taken away some of those spaces in between where trust is created. So my provocation is, if we truly believe that culture and access to cultural assets, participation and engagement improves lives, then we will need the full force of our creativity, our honesty and our bravery to cast out what was not working and it was not engaging those who need it most, to think of newer, better ways to include those who need it most, and to be designing not only our new spaces, our new cities and our services, but to ensure that our remit is also to pay attention to the spaces in between them, where the human connection begins that allows our trust in each other to emerge. So that's me, Kenneth, back to you.
Nicola, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for that. I've got so many questions, not just for you, Nicola, but for everybody. In fact, I'm very conscious we've been joined by so many guests and from all around the world, which I'm delighted to see. I'm just going to encourage you, all guests online here, if you've got a question, you've all been introducing yourself online, which is great. If you've got a question, post your question in the box, in the chat box, and I'll read it out for you and put it to our guests. I'm also intrigued about the cross-cultural sharing we're doing here. Nicola made a reference there that she went around football clubs and then bingo halls. But if you see a bingo hall in Scotland, everyone knows exactly what you're talking about. I wonder if you have bingo halls in Mexico, India, and the United States, but we'll come back to that. So just to encourage everyone to ask questions, I'm going to just go to the first of our other online contributors. You may know that the Edinburgh International Cultural Summit has created essentially a knowledge network of many partners around the world, universities, culture institutions, ministries, and so on. And many of the members of those institutions are online. The first is Vallejo Gantner, who is the Artistic and Executive Director of the Onassis Foundation in the United States. So Vallejo, I wonder if I could ask you just to put your question, and also, as with all our questioners, as well as putting a question, could you say to whom it is directed? Vallejo.
Well, I guess it's to the whole panel, but also, as it were, to those who are in the film and to the film in general. I mean, and I think we've all been, so many of my questions were already answered actually, but it's really about how do we create in a moment where the physical infrastructure that we all think about typically when we talk about that word is under severe challenge from COVID, when our ability to gather is obviously challenged. How do we create and use this crisis to create new models of sustainability and of viability for an artistic ecosystem? So not simply whether that is funding systems or presenting models, commissioning and producing, using the physical infrastructure, but also sometimes letting it go. Because ultimately, when you, particularly in cities like New York, where we've been deeply concerned with questions of gentrification and the challenges of the survivability in those cities, and I know that's true in different environments in the UK and around the world, the viability of these ecosystems is under threat. And how do we sustain those, leaving aside the buildings?
Vallejo, thank you very much. That very much picks up on the theme developed by several contributors. Nicola talked about casting out things that weren't working, but Pablo, I wonder if I might come to you first. You introduced your remarks by suggesting that previous global pandemics had actually had invigorating effect on culture. So I wonder, it was quite an optimistic thing to see in the face of the bleak prospect we've got at the moment. So Pablo, in Mexico, can you see culture blooming where the pandemic has already wrought its problems?
Well, we all saw in these months how cultural communities react to the pandemics first than anybody. I'm talking about creators and artists, and they become as an important part of the contention. No? We understand that now culture is also a health instrument. We saw how culture took problems or understood the problem first with childhood and the activities that were programmed there, how to help communities to be in their own homes, how artists and creators produce a lot of content, concerts, plays, child activities, and we saw also how they work on that. But also we learn a lesson from that, because all that communities are working very hard on that, and many times they didn't see a penny for that. And that's one of the main concerns and the main responsibilities for the future, talking about authorities and policymakers, how to help cultural and artistic communities to put them in the track of the cultural economy. Many countries and institutions are talking about the return of the Tobin tax or the called Google tax, how to make the owners of company telephones or internet to put the artists in the productive chain where they are not. And I think this is the main challenge. The other challenge is to understand the change of public space. The public space is the most private space now, no? The place we're speaking now from our house in the most public space arena that is outside. So this also change the idea of culture, and it forces us to have new perspectives and new ways to work in order to work also with the economy of culture. And talking about the economy of culture, we have two arms: the digital one, that is like the big expectation, and the other one that Nicola says, that is the outside, the public space, the buildings, the way how we're going to use the museums, the theaters, but also how we're going to understand the use of public space in a time where the equation of time is out, because we're not we still don't know when we're going back to the public space, or if the second wave is going to crash. So we are doing these questions every day, but also we understand that the public space changed a lot, but I think that that thing that is flexible is never broken.
Pablo, thank you very much for that. And I'll come to you in a second, Nicola, but Rahul, I wonder if I could just, again, pick you up, because people are talking about this, the changing use of public space, the fact that we're not sharing public space anymore. So maybe if we're looking for areas to save money, to not invest, I was joking earlier that you were talking yourself out of a job, but maybe that is where we save and we divert money away from big pieces of public architecture into the small scale cultural schemes, which are actually more important to people now.
No, thanks for that question. I'm going to attempt to save my profession and make an argument for architecture. But before you go there, your question on bingo, you know, I mean, of course, it's a game. Well, as we say in India, bingo, cricket, these are all Indian games that were invented by the British. And so they've survived in all our clubs and, of course, very alive. I don't know about Mexico, but I just wanted to sort of flag that out because you'd asked. But look, Pablo, thank you for those comments. I mean, I think those are kind of bang on. And I think for you to end on public space is really pertinent, because the public space has become, it's a kind of pushback. We can't animate it anymore. It's really become private. It's a void now in our cities. So how do we animate this? But I want to kind of go back to the question that was asked, which was, and I think that question ended on these ecologies. How do you make this ecology work? And ecology is about interdependencies and interconnectedness. Let me just sort of argue, maybe this is going out a bit on a lark, but you know, this is an opportunity to also imagine the form of infrastructure more broadly. We have for too long imagined our buildings as monofunctional, and we've imagined our infrastructure as monofunctional. Like, so our high schools are all lying empty because no one can go in there, and the concert halls are lying empty. I think we've got to nuance the idea of infrastructure into cultural infrastructure, you know, service infrastructure, health infrastructure, education infrastructure, social infrastructure of other kinds. And we have to find ways of imagining these as not being monofunctional, because if one can create these interdependencies that within the same investment, many things can be supported either on a temporal scale or on a seasonal scale, it'll just make all our infrastructure much more robust, because it'll be cohabited on a 24-hour, 365-day cycle. And that will create the interdependencies. It'll create the resilience. Otherwise, we've locked ourselves into massive investments into monofunctional infrastructure, which doesn't allow an ecology to form. And I think this is, I mean, more conceptual, but I think this is a good opportunity to address this issue more generally.
Well, thank you very much. And every time I hear an answer, I want to go down a different pursue it. But Nicola, I want to come to you again, just because you did pursue this issue that Vallejo raised about trying to change the emphasis, recognize what's not working in our cultural arena. But that's very difficult. I mean, the cultural communities are fighting for money at the best of times. It's even more problematic now. So how do we recognize what's not working? Who's going to be the person that calls out? I mean, could you name a cultural sector that isn't deserving of support or public support or finance?
I don't think that I should name, but I think that if we asked our communities and if we talk to our communities who are most disadvantaged, they could tell us quite straightforward what services are working for them and what services are not. So I guess my provocation really is, again, about that relationship between us as institutions, as us as public service, really, and ensuring that we are truly connected into our communities, regardless of whether you're a small community-based organisation or whether you're a national organisation. So I think that real honest dialogue with communities is where that has to take place. But I also I wouldn't want to imagine a world where we didn't also invest in architecture and physical infrastructure. And as much as I believe that right now the response would be about locality and placing more artists and creative practitioners within our communities, I love our buildings and our museums and our galleries, but I absolutely agree with Rahul when we talk about thinking differently about what they're for, how we use them, and I would actually apply that to us as people and the roles that we take on. So I liked the way when you described it, Rahul, as this elastic, but in Sistema Scotland, although we employ musicians, their role is really elastic. So it's not just about being in the room with the children and young people teaching music. It is about understanding holistically what's happening within that community, what's happening within the children and families' lives. And I do think that as practitioners, whatever sector you are in, we could all get better at thinking not just about our buildings and how they can become more multifunctional, but actually about that blend across our roles, what we are there tasked to deliver, and just letting go of some of those sort of non-physical structures and boundaries that we started to put into place. If we just chip away at those and just think, how do we work together to make our society best? If that's what we turned up every day and asked ourselves and worked with colleagues on that, we would probably do some different things when we went to work every day.
Nicola, thanks for that. I could just stay with you. I want to put a question that Daniel Jimenez from Morecambe has posted online, and that was because it's about communities such as the ones that you support in Stirling and Raploch and so on. Why is it taking so much time to react to COVID in terms of artistic support? Why is there so poor support for artistic community in communities such as yours?
So a good question. I don't know if I can answer it fully, but I think that, as a society, we responded firstly with that kind of basic humanitarian need. Our response to COVID, I think, was rightly to say, actually, the public health emergency, where, what is it that needs to be done from a kind of physical health perspective, and there were some real infrastructure that had to be rebuilt really quickly to ensure that our NHS could support that and that people had access to food. There were people in Scotland, a developed country, many people who immediately when our services closed, we needed to get them access to food. Personally, I think that some of our cultural and artistic organisations have been supported well. So an organisation like myself, with Sistema Scotland, we've got lots of different funders, and we had a good response where trusts and foundations and public sector funders were saying to us straight away, it's okay, we will be flexible. Think about what you can do. But I think those have been hardest hit have been our freelance practitioners, our gig economy workers, who, when our institutions closed, there's been lack of clarity around about, you know, understanding when things will reopen, what that means. So I really, really hope that that's going to change. I think that the announcement from the UK government and the Scottish government working on just now, the response of the recovery support for the cultural economy, I think will help. I feel a little bit more optimistic about that, but I'm really aware that I'm speaking from a place of privilege there within an organisation that has been well supported. And I've worked, you know, many of the musicians who work with us have got a dual role. They work with us and they're freelancers, and I know it's been a really, really tough time.
Well, I have to say, I'm delighted it is well supported. But Pablo, I wonder if I might come to you again. Nicola's right. The first reaction has been to prioritise the health, social and economic needs of the community, but people individually have felt terribly culturally naked, as it were, you know, in the absence of being able to go out to join each other in shared spaces. In Mexico, has it been any different, or have you also been having to battle for support for the cultural sector, and are you still doing that?
We have a battle for support, and we have a lot of questioning and also apportation of the cultural community. The cultural community and organizations propose to organize a pool in order to analyze the economic impact in cultural communities. They also promote the way that we have to build the funds. I have to say that the problem the problem is the same all over the world. The money is never enough, and the states and governments face that with that reality. But in the other hand, we have the questions for the future. We have now a time in advance. We are very with expectation about the economics and digital, but we think that is not all, and we need to think in a model, an economic creative culture model that we are working now, not just to have the enough information. We started, for example, in Mexico with a program called Telar. It's like a register of communities and artists in order to have enough information to take decisions, and in the short period of time, in the next semesters, build the supports to the communities and social services for them. But also we need to think how to build a creative model, not just for make the state work, in order to build a creative economy sustainable. And that's the main and most important work to do in the next future. We are working in something called Mexico Creativo, Creative Mexico, that is going to be a kind of dialogue, permanent dialogue from this month to next November. We're having dialogues with international institutions and countries, and also states in Mexico and creators, in order to build an important agenda, because we need to fix some laws about taxes or about development. We need to build some policies about social security for the artists, and we need to answer where the state have to invest in order to know that this will be money that we never see again, and where the state have to do to invest in order to make cultural projects sustainable. And this is, I think, the major work we have in the next few months. And trying to answer the Daniel Jimenez Cacho question, I think we react with what we have. We are working with, I don't know if I can say the amounts in Mexico. We have a very strong program in the digital way with the platform called Contigo en la Distancia, with you on the distance. we also distribute an amount of huge amount of money in the States, and now we are working in the next months. But saying that the most difficult thing in the equation that I said how I said at the beginning is the equation of time, because we don't know exactly when we're going to be back on streets regularly. We are now going back slowly, opening the museums and the public spaces very slow, but everything depends on the second hit and the way the pandemic behaves. So the future in the next 5 months or a year, it will be accompanied. It had to be worked with the building of a creative, of a cultural economy project that I think is the thing that every country is working on. We have been in some meetings with IFACA, for example, or with you, and all over the world, the concerns are the same. How are we going to build a cultural economy? How are we going to put the cultural subjects, the cultural issue at the same level of health or work or education? And I think this is an opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Pablo. Yes, I think we are all wrestling with that issue. I wonder if I could bring in Clara Miller. Clara is, of course, the Professor Emerita at the Heron Foundation and contributed to our film earlier. Clara, you were talking, you said very earlier in the film that artists can't help being artists, but supporting them is a more difficult problem, is it not? What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Well, this is an enormously rich discussion. I'm just enjoying it so much, and love Nicola's the spaces in between, and Pablo's comments about the plaza as opposed to necessarily the opera box, and am just so taken with Rahul's idea of this kind of invisible cultural infrastructure being trust and the rules of engagement, the predictability that builds community that is invisible and that, you know, happens in the streets of Mumbai and maybe not so much in the cold streets of New York. And here in the States, I think we're experiencing what happens when that implicit infrastructure of culture is frayed and neglected, and there are consequences to that. So as we go forward, and we're all talking about building a new infrastructure, one that includes buildings but goes beyond, of course, and how, and I guess maybe Rahul, I'm talking to everybody. Everybody has an answer to this question, I'm sure. But how are the emerging business models, the new kinds of technological economies, the online world, how is that going to contribute or detract from building trust and creating these new relationships that we need so desperately, I think, in the world, this new culture, if you will?
Rahul.
No, thank you, Clara, for that. That's really a rich question. And also your comments, especially, I think you're pointing to the idea that whether it's literature or music or arts or architecture, these are all different lenses that help us imagine possibilities and see the future in different ways. And I think that is so bang on. I think to kind of get to your question, my response would be, and this was also something in the chat about a concern, what would happen, with the more professional artistic sector. And I think that's a really good question. And I would just sort of clarify, but also argue, that when we are talking about this kind of more ephemeral, temporal, mobile sort of infrastructure, we've got to decouple it from what is the business as usual imagination of that, which is the production of popular culture. In the same ways as I argue that in a city like Mumbai, which I call the kinetic city, I think what buildings look like and what they mean are often quite different. They don't embody the same associations as we would in the business as usual kind of model. And I think the digital world, I think everything that's been unsettled is forcing us to decouple some of these usual comprehensions. And so I actually, for me, I think if cultural infrastructure, which worked in the way I'm kind of describing it on a temporal scale, actually allowed professional artistic producers to use that platform and penetrate communities and societies they never had, and you reverse that and you get very formal architectural spaces to become platforms for popular cultural performances, for example. I think this is the opportunity we have. And I think the digital world, the pandemic, I think us just questioning these categories, this is a fantastic opportunity to do that.
Rahul, thank you very much. I'm so conscious of the time here. Just as our conversation livens up, we're running up against the clock, but there's a number of questions online. Three of them, Nicola from Cinzia, William and Sarah, all about community theatre. When do communities become vibrant? About the role of music. All I thought directed specifically at you. So, is your community vibrant in the face of the pandemic?
Well, I think that, I mean, my perspective though would be that there are so many different interpretations of the word community. So I think that there are communities, you know, we at Sistema Scotland, we locate ourselves within geographical places within which there can be multiple communities within them interacting with each other in different ways. So as a starting point, they are already vibrant in many different ways. And I think that there will be elements of vibrancy that will always maintain. I think the human spirit is incredible in the face of adversity. And even, you know, when we go to work with a community, we go there because it has got many challenges, it's got many issues, and we believe that we can bring music and use it to it's not to turn it into a vibrant community, it's to remind and shine the spotlight on it. And I remember one of my favourite quotes that a head teacher of a nursery school said to me when we just started Big Noise many years ago. She said to me after about 6 months, I think what Big Noise has done is it's re-sparked the imagination of the community. So there was so much vibrancy. Anybody has just to go. You know, I've obviously been talking about playgrounds and school locations. Can you tell I've got a 4-year-old? You know, so these are the places where I inhabit just now. You just need to go there. Children are vibrant. You know, those communities will continue. But I think what we believe as a community here today is that we as cultural people, as cultural practitioners, by sharing our passions, by sharing our talents, we use them to enable and to shine new spotlights and to help people discover things. So just to continue to spark the imagination, and through that, if we can do that in all of our communities, not just those that have got the privilege to engage, that might have had the confidence to engage, that's the duty on us, is to really think. And right now for me with COVID, it's the fact that this will have negatively impacted on certain communities within, or, you know, certain physical communities, certain communities who've got protected characteristics. And I think there's an onus on us to think about, yeah, of course there's still vibrancy there. Of course there are still, you know, positive things that will be happening. But can we ensure what we have to offer can enhance that and enable that imagination to continue to be sparked to create a brighter future for us all?
Nicola, thank you. I'm so conscious that I haven't even done justice to our librarians, who I thought were amongst the most powerful of the contributors to our films. We're reimagining libraries, a point that you picked up on, Rahul, but I'm afraid we've classically run out of time. So if I may, I'm going to use this opportunity to thank, first of all, Vallejo and Clara for joining us online with the questions, and our three main panelists, to Dr. Pablo Raphael de la Madrid, Rahul Mehrotra and Nicola Cullen. Thank you very much indeed for your contribution and for your, in fact, not just this webinar, for the contribution you're making to our culture, our cultural life. And may I take this opportunity to remind you that there are 2 more webinars about the role of culture in transforming our communities, tomorrow and Wednesday. Tomorrow on culture and education, and on Wednesday discussing culture and social cohesion. And I hope you can join in those discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Ken. My name's Jonathan Mills, and obviously I've helped organise these webinars and the summit. I'm delighted by the response that we've had. We will take note of all of your questions, and we will attempt to distill those into some kind of communication with you. So please, if your question hasn't been answered, do not worry. We've taken note of it, and we're inspired by your interest. I want to thank particularly the panelists, particularly Pablo, Rahul and Nicola for their contribution. And this reminded me in a way of particularly the point that Rahul was making of a really interesting example of multi-use cultural space that was brought to the attention of the summit in 2016 by Parmesh Shahani, who described his activities in creating a visual arts community in the evenings in a corporate headquarters. 7 o'clock in the evening, people would actually leave their offices. There would be an hour of transformation, and from 7 and about 8 o'clock in the evening till 8 o'clock in the morning, it was a vibrant community of artists' studios. So these things are already happening. I'm sure they're going to have to happen far more prominently and far more widespread. Tomorrow, we will hear about culture and education, a film that we've prepared for that, featuring Asal Habibi, and she will be joined by young Scott, Emma Ruse, and an alumna of the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, Liliana Morales, in a webinar chaired by James Hampson from the British Council. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Presiding Officer, for chairing this so deftly. We obviously need a bit more time, but thanks very much for being part of the first webinar for the special edition of the Edinburgh International Culture Summit in 2020. Goodbye.